This video is sponsored by Into the AM. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Jack Kesey's Hellboy comes face to face with the Crooked Man. In 1959, Hellboy and BPRD agent Bobby Joe Song, played by Jack Kesey and Adeline Rudolph respectively, survive when their train crashes in rural Appalachia. They find themselves in a community ruled over by witches and superstition, with the worst of all being the Crooked Man, played by Martin Bassendale, who collects souls for the devil. Teaming up with ex-soldier Tom Farrell, played by Jefferson White, and witch Cora Fisher, played by Hannah Margaretson, Hellboy must investigate and confront the Crooked Man if they hope to escape. 20 years ago, the Dark Horse superhero character Hellboy burst onto the screen with Guillermo del Toro's film. Yes, I know, I'm ripping that band-aid off early. It makes me feel ancient to know that's 2 decades old at this point. That was then, of course, followed by its sequel, The Golden Army, in 2008, and there was also 2 animated spin-off films as well. It was a perfect project for del Toro, who was a fan of the comics, and especially for his regular collaborator, Ron Perlman, who was pitch-perfect casting to playing the cigar-chomping Big Red Demon. When you think of Hellboy, you likely think of Ron Perlman as the character. But while del Toro's Hellboy films are well liked and have a huge cult following, they were never big box office successes. The 2 live-action films were even made by 2 different film studios. So because of that, attempts at making a third film with del Toro and Perlman eventually collapsed, despite the fact that fans to this day still wish for them to make a third film together. But the rights to the character eventually went to Millennium Media, who are best known for making The Expendables, and they rebooted the character back in 2019. The 2019 film was a hugely trolled production, with director Neil Marshall clashing with the producers, and that is very visible on screen, and I thought that was one of the worst films of the year. I thought it was a really bloody mess, in all honesty. Unsurprisingly, for a hard R reboot no one was really asking for to a character that already had a spotty box office track record, the 2019 film was a critical and commercial flop, despite being intended to launch a new franchise that even ended on sequel bait that of course never happened. Now, 5 years later, Millennium have rebooted the character again with The Crooked Man, based directly on the story of the same name from the comics. Hellboy creator Mike Mignola is deeply involved with this film, even co-adapting his work for the screen, and he has expressed some feelings in interviews that the del Toro films didn't quite get the tone of the comics right. The new film is directed and co-written by Brian Taylor, who directed Mom and Dad, but is best known for collaborating with Mark Neville on the Crank films, as well as the second Ghost Rider movie, Spirit of Vengeance, and they also co-wrote the notorious flop Jonah Hex, so not exactly the best of track records when it comes to comic book adaptations. And The Crooked Man hasn't been so much released as limped out. Publicity for the film has been scant, and the first that many people even heard of it was when the teaser trailer leaked online, and many people didn't have a very high opinion of that trailer. It has been gradually released across several territories theatrically over the last several months, including here in the UK, but in America, the distributor Ketchup Entertainment instead decided to give it a straight-to-VOD burial after they initially intended to release it in cinemas. And I think this suggests that someone at Ketchup did actually sit down and watch it, because The Crooked Man is by far the least of the Hellboy films, and yes, that even includes the 2019 one. By the way, if you like the shirt that I've been wearing throughout this review, it's another design from Into the AM, my sponsor for this video, and I chose this one because of its futuristic exploration theme, and it's quite strikingly presented on this design. They've got a whole host of great ones, and it was quite hard to actually pick between all of them. And I do have to say that it's quite a soft, comfortable t-shirt as well. It hangs off me quite nicely. So if you want to grab this shirt or one of their whole host of designs, use my affiliate link intotheam.com/filmbrain, where you can get 10% off and you support the channel as well, and thanks to them for sponsoring this video. The signs are bad very early on in The Crooked Man. The film begins with the closest thing it has to a big special effects sequence where Hellboy has to fight this spider that they're transporting by train, which then suddenly grows to massive size and causes the train to derail, and the effects in this sequence are very poor. shot. As usual for Millennium, the film is shot in Bulgaria, which means that if you look at the end credits, almost all the crew's names end in A or V, quite amusingly. But they also use their own in-house visual effects company, Worldwide Effects. So if you've ever watched something like The Expendables and wondered why the CGI in them looks so consistently iffy, yeah, that would be the reason why. And looking at The Crooked Man, it really feels like Millennium haven't come that far from their New Image days when they were making things like Shark Attack 3. The spider looks like it's come out of a PlayStation 2 game in particular, with noticeably jerky animation in several shots, and the shot of the train, especially when it's crashing down through the trees, really look especially bad. They look very low res and primitive. Moreover, the film barely even introduces Hellboy in its opening stages, which is perhaps an understandable choice given he's already had 2 previous film adaptations, but it also assumes the audience is already familiar with the character because they saw those films, if they don't already read the comic books. And I don't think the character is really as popular in the same way as Spider-Man, Batman, or Superman to get away with this, because those characters, anyone could tell you their origin story, whereas here, you need to make it clearly defined from the jump that this is a separate version of the character from the previous films. So if you're a newcomer, this is not exactly a great place to jump on board, although I will say that it does its own version of Hellboy's origin story, conveyed largely through dialogue. Hellboy was found in a church in this iteration, much like he was in the comics, and there's also sequences where the character confronts his birth mother in the afterlife. And aside from a couple of mentions that he was on Life magazine, that's really all the details that you get. And also, no one seems to treat Hellboy particularly in a special way. No one seems surprised or startled to see a big red demon in their midst for the most part. It really takes away from the mystique or the stature of the character. He's just some random dude in this story. I think that Jack Kesey is probably the weakest actor to play the character today, although he's clearly doing the best he can with the material and the makeup that he's in. Perlman's version of Hellboy leaves some very big horns to fill. He effectively defined the character, and I wasn't a big fan of David Harbour's take, who I personally felt got a bit swamped in his own makeup a lot of the time. Kesey's is also hampered by his makeup, but in a different way, in that it looks rather underwhelming, to be honest. He looks like a really good cosplayer, but he also doesn't have a big charismatic presence, and that's not just because of the writing, that is a performance issue. He doesn't really stand out or bring all that much to the character. I think that's partly because the film does focus on Hellboy less, and he even feels like a side player within his own movie a lot of the time, but Kesey just doesn't make the character feel like his own. When I was watching his performance, it felt like he was taking a lot of cues from Ron Perlman's performance, which is a good place to start, especially because that's the version that most people will be familiar with, but it feels more like an impression. It feels more like he's trying to do what Perlman would have done in this performance, which would have provided a bit of continuity if it was meant to be connected with the Del Toro films, which it isn't. But that lack of explanation or backstory also applies to Bobby Joe, who is a new character that was created directly for the film, a rookie agent that's more comfortable behind a desk than she is out in the field. The character, to me, reminded me a lot of Rupert Evans' Myers from the 2004 film, largely there to send and receive exposition, and a character that Del Toro hated so much they had him sent off to Antarctica in the second film. But Bobby Joe is also meant to be Hellboy's love interest, which came as a deep surprise to me when I was watching this, because Hellboy spends so much of the early going being passive-aggressive and condescending to her, saying things like, "After you," and making fun of the fact that she's inexperienced, and then we're suddenly being told that he's actually being protective towards her and trying to keep her out of danger because he has feelings for her that he can't express. It's like she's been written 2 different ways in either half of the film. But Joe is also the only other BPRD agent in the film. There's a government agent on the train, but he's killed off immediately. So don't expect any appearance from the likes of, say, Abe Sapien or anyone like that, mostly because the budget, doesn't allow for it. Now, you might be familiar with the term ashcan copy, which are works made expressly for the purpose of holding on to rights, usually made very cheaply. It actually originated from comic books, but you do sometimes see it with films. Think notoriously of the Corman Fantastic Four that was never released, or those Weinstein Hellraiser and Children of the Corn sequels, or whenever Warren Beatty sits down as Dick Tracy to have a Laird Molson interview. I was not the only one who felt that vibe about The Crooked Man from that very first teaser, or the indifferent approach to its release, and now that I've seen the film, I can confirm that it played to me and felt like an ashcan film. It looks extremely cheap from start to finish. The budget for The Crooked Man is reportedly $20 million, which is just under half of the 2019 film, which itself would be the smallest for a Hellboy live action movie, but when I was watching it, it actually felt like it cost half that, if not less. There's minimal characters in the movie. There's only about 9 or so credited actors, and relatively few locations. In fact, much of it is just wandering around in the woods, which is the cheapest location you can film in a lot of the time. Of the money they did have, the filmmakers clearly spent it wisely by putting it into practical effects, which look way better than whenever they have to resort to CGI. The Crooked Man in particular looks very good whenever he actually bothers to show up in his own movie, but there's also one memorable standout sequence in my opinion, where Cora, who is shapeshifted into a raccoon, climbs back into the skin of a human body. It's really got this kinetic, gross out energy. The raccoon climbs back into this lifeless body, just draped over a bed like a coat. It's very, very stark, and it's actually a sign of what this film could have been if it had more money behind it. Now, in theory, there's nothing wrong with a smaller scale Hellboy film that's closer to something in the comics. You think of something like a procedural, almost like a Monster of the Week X-Files. That sounds like fun. Have Hellboy do some actual investigating. We haven't seen a lot of that in the previous Hellboy films. Likewise, in concept, the idea of Hellboy just dropping into something like an Evil Dead movie sounds great. Going for more of a horror vibe would again set it apart from the previous adaptations, but the execution is limp and compromised. They just clearly didn't have enough money to do this justice. The Crooked Man's production values resemble a fan film than something actually paid to see money in a cinema. And if it was a fan film, you'd be so much more forgiving of its limitations because it would be someone's passion project, something they did on their own dime with their own money with their friends, but not something that has come out from a semi-major studio like Millennium, who are now looking like late period canon films on the evidence of this. Taylor tries to compensate for the lack of budget by bathing the film in darkness to try and hide it, but that means that large chunks of the film are so murky that it's hard to even see what's happening at times. It's so dim that there were several points in the film where you can't see the actors' faces in close-ups, and sometimes that's because they're backlit in dark rooms, especially in the final section of the movie where they're wandering around this house and there's light pouring in from the windows, but it's so behind them that they're just blotting out the faces, which is a bit of a problem for a movie that already has a character with a dark red face. At least Del Toro's stylized lighting meant that you could always see what was happening even in dimly lit scenes. However, The Crooked Man is also sloppily put together in ways that have nothing to do with its budget, like editing. I have never in my life seen a film that has had so many fade to blacks in it. I joke they got the film ready for commercial breaks on television. They've got the ad space directly inserted into the movie, but there's actually more than that. For the whole first half of the film, it feels like almost every sequence, sometimes every scene in some cases, has a cut or a fade to black at the end of it. And it's so weird and distracting because they're not even necessary. These scenes would cut together fine and they'd flow. And the fact that they don't makes it feel even more disjointed because it feels like it's been assembled out of multiple different parts. And then the film starts doing chapters midway through, which is one of my least favourite modern movie things, although only half-heartedly and only doing it twice, which makes you wonder why they even bothered to do that either. The visuals and the editing don't help with a movie that already has problems with coherency in its script. I was genuinely struggling at points to follow why things were even happening sometimes. Sometimes because of the way the film looked, and other times because the script does such a bad job of explaining itself or what is even happening on screen half the time. To its credit, the script is at times so close and so faithful to its source material that it's actually using direct quotes of the dialogue. But lines like, "Okay, Snake, let's rattle," they might sound badass on the page in a speech bubble, but they sound goofy coming out of an actual person. But it also just doesn't do a good job of making the story intelligible for those that haven't read the comic story it was based on, i.e. someone like me in the audience. If you're a fan of the source material, it might be a little bit more decipherable, but it still feels like elements were dropped or condensed massively because they had to really pinch in order to make the budget of the movie. Really, the main character of the film isn't even Hellboy, it's Tom, who has a cursed lucky bone that is massively important. That's thanks to trickery from a witch as a boy that meant that he had an encounter with the Crooked Man at a young age. But even this prop looks weak despite it being a key point of the movie. The bone is from the body of a cat, you see, and so it's so small and so tiny that it often looks like it was plucked from the bottom of a KFC bargain bucket. Like, it's literally like this tiny hair-like bone that occasionally glows at the end of it. Not exactly a great prop to put at the centre of your movie. Tom also spends much of the film carrying the corpse of his father to bury, although you'd actually be mistaken a lot of the time for thinking it was a sleeping bag because it's draped over his shoulder with clearly no weight to it whatsoever. Yeah, I did hear that dead people are usually quite heavy a lot of the time. That brings us to the one other sequence of note, which is a lengthy showdown set in a church. In fact, so much of the film takes place in this one location that I think about a third of the running time takes place in this church. But that's when the Crooked Man actually shows up to summon the dead to attack our heroes, and the film seems to acknowledge its debt to John Carpenter, specifically Assault on Precinct 13, by having the score suddenly start channeling the theme to The Thing, like dun 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 dun. Yeah, I could be watching much better movies instead. Or maybe this sequence is just notable for the fact that Joseph Marcel pops up as a blind priest in this segment, probably best known for playing Joffrey the Butler in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So if you ever want to see Joffrey call someone a motherfucker, this is the movie for you. But again, it's hindered by very busy camera work and rapid cutting in dim lighting that makes it especially hard to see in the franticness of it all. And nor is the film especially scary, apart from turning the volume way up for its jump scares, especially as it starts limping towards an underwhelming conclusion. In fact, the sound design is so unbalanced and those jump scares are so obnoxious that I actually feel like it might have been left unfinished. What the film is lacking most of all, though, is a sense of joy. Del Toro clearly had fun with all the phantasmagoria, even Marshall to a certain extent, but the Crooked Man is just relentlessly grey visually and just straight up dull from end to end. It isn't even so bad it's good. I just found this tedious to sit through. Only die-hard fans of Hellboy need to bother with the Crooked Man. It at best feels like a stopgap until they do another bigger reboot in a few years' time, and this is mostly there just to hold on to the rights until that point. Now there is effort put into a few areas, but the massive limitations are extremely obvious, and the production values are well below par for a theatrical release. There are films made for streaming on even less money that look far superior. Even something like Megan Fox's Subservience, which was also made by Millennium, that looks 10 times more polished than this. Hell, the 2019 film was also slicker, and that had some terrible CGI shots in it at points. The character deserves far better treatment, and it's bad enough that I think it usurps Madam Web as the worst comic book film of the year, because at least you can get some ironic entertainment value out of that. This, at best, feels perfunctory. Stick to the Del Toro films, send this back to hell. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can smash away the evils of demonetization with my Patreon, where you can see my videos early, among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.